The morning of Wisteria. Village's annual Daffodil Festival dawned with that particular English clarity that promised warmth by afternoon. And Miss Jane Marple, adjusting her pale blue cardigan against the spring breeze, made her way down Primrose Lane with the unhurried gait of someone who had learned that life's most interesting revelations often came to those who simply watched and waited. The village green buzzed with the familiar choreography of community preparation, bunting fluttering like prayer flags above the flower stalls, where Mrs. Evelyn Pemberton arranged her prized daffodils with the precision of a master jeweler, each golden bloom positioned to catch the light just so, while nearby Mrs. Dorothy Bantry directed the placement of tea tables with theatrical gestures that would have done credit to a West End production, her voice carrying across the green as she instructed young Timothy Fletcher on the proper angle for the refreshment tent. Though Miss Marple noticed with the quiet attention she applied to all human behavior that there was something particularly animated about dear Dolly today, a brightness that seemed almost forced, like stage makeup applied too heavily in daylight. Dr. Geoffrey Hartwell approached with his customary cheerful manner, medical bag in one hand and steaming cup in the other, pausing to inquire about her rheumatism with the genuine concern that had endeared him to the village since his arrival 3 years ago. Though when Miss Marple mentioned young Mrs. Collins looking rather piqued at yesterday's church service, she observed how his expression grew thoughtful and he spoke carefully of expectant mothers and recent stress before excusing himself with unusual haste, leaving her to wonder what particular pressures might be affecting the doctor's newest patient. The morning progressed with the gentle rhythm of village life, streams of residents arriving to admire displays and sample Mrs. Bantry's famous seed cake. And from her strategic position near the tea tent, Miss Marple noted the various social currents that flowed through any gathering of this sort. How Colonel Weatherby avoided the flower competition area, despite his usual horticultural interests. How young Sarah Collins kept glancing toward the church path as though expecting someone who hadn't yet arrived. And most intriguingly, how Mrs. Pemberton's assistant, a nervous young man named Peter Ashford who had arrived in the village only months ago under circumstances that remained mysteriously vague, dropped his tray of prized daffodils not once but twice, his hands trembling as though suffering from some internal agitation that drew sharp criticism from his employer, whose voice carried clearly across the green as she declared him a clumsy fool without proper appreciation for beauty, causing the young man's face to flush crimson, though he bent to retrieve the scattered blooms without protest, his jaw tightening with suppressed emotion that Miss Marple filed away in that capacious mental catalogue she maintained of human nature's infinite variations. As afternoon approached, the festival reached its crescendo with the flower competition announcement, Mrs. Pemberton standing beside her magnificent daffodil arrangement with confidence radiating from every fiber, while other contestants gathered with expressions ranging from hopeful to resigned, though Miss Marple noticed that Mrs. Bantry seemed particularly tense, her gloved hands clasped so tightly that her knuckles showed white beneath the fabric. And when Reverend Clement cleared his throat to address the assembled crowd, announcing with dramatic pause that the winner by unanimous decision was Mrs. Dorothy Bantry for her exceptional heritage. Daffodils, the silence that followed was profound and uncomfortable. Mrs. Bantry's face cycling through shades from pale to pink to deep red, while Mrs. Pemberton's expression transformed from anticipation to shock to something far more dangerous as she declared there must be some mistake, her display clearly superior to anyone with eyes, demanding a recount with such vehemence that Miss Marple observed how Peter Ashford went very still, his gaze fixed on his employer with an expression she couldn't quite read, while Dr. Hartwell moved closer to Mrs. Collins, perhaps anticipating stress might affect her delicate condition, and most significantly, how Mrs. Bantry seemed almost as surprised by her victory as Mrs. Pemberton was by her defeat, the confrontation escalating until young Timothy Fletcher came running from the direction of the church, his face white with terror as he gasped for them to come quickly. Someone had been murdered, there was a body in the vestry, and the peaceful afternoon shattered like fine china dropped on stone, the golden daffodils suddenly seeming to mock the terrible silence that descended upon Wisteria Village's spring celebration. The crowd moved toward St. Bartholomew's Church with the peculiar urgency that accompanies catastrophe, some hurrying with morbid curiosity while others followed reluctantly, as though proximity to tragedy might somehow contaminate their ordered lives. Miss Marple walked with measured steps, her keen eyes noting how each villager responded to crisis in ways that revealed more about their character than years of pleasant social interaction ever could. Dr. Hartwell immediately assumed professional authority, his medical training asserting itself as he pushed through the gathering crowd with quiet determination, while Mrs. Bantry seemed almost to shrink into herself, her earlier triumph at the flower competition now forgotten in the face of something far more serious than horticultural rivalry. The ancient church stood silent in the afternoon light, its Norman stones having witnessed centuries of human drama, but perhaps nothing quite like this unfolding tragedy. Timothy Fletcher, still pale with shock, led them to the side entrance where the vestry door stood, slightly ajar, and Dr. Hartwell quickly took charge, instructing everyone to remain outside while he examined the situation, though Miss Marple positioned herself near enough to observe without appearing intrusive, a skill perfected through decades of village life. The wait seemed interminable, filled with hushed whispers and nervous speculation, until Dr. Hartwell emerged with the grave expression that confirmed their worst fears. "I'm afraid Henry Collins is dead," he announced quietly, his professional composure barely concealing genuine shock. "We must contact the police immediately and disturb nothing further." The words fell like stones into still water, creating ripples of horror and disbelief that spread through the assembled villagers. Sarah Collins, who had been hovering anxiously at the edge of the crowd, swayed visibly at the confirmation, her hand instinctively moving to her rounded belly as Dr. Hartwell quickly moved to support her, guiding her to a nearby bench with gentle efficiency. Miss Marple found herself fascinated not by the tragedy itself, but by the immediate reactions it provoked. Mrs. Pemberton's first concern appeared to be whether the festival would continue, her face showing more irritation than grief, while Peter Ashford had gone very quiet and pale, standing apart from the others with an expression that suggested internal calculation rather than sorrow. Colonel Weatherby muttered grimly about the state of modern society and the lack of proper security, his military bearing reasserting itself in the face of genuine crisis, though Miss Marple noticed how his eyes kept darting toward the church as though expecting some enemy to emerge from its shadows. The arrival of Inspector Barnes from the county police brought a different energy to the scene, his brisk efficiency and confident manner immediately establishing him as someone who preferred straightforward solutions to complex mysteries. Miss Marple watched with quiet interest as he surveyed the assembled villagers with the air of a man certain that rural crimes were simple affairs easily solved by applying basic logic to obvious motives. His initial questioning of Timothy Fletcher quickly established a timeline placing the murder sometime between noon and 2 o'clock, when the festival activities would have provided excellent cover for someone to slip away unnoticed. "The vestry door was slightly open when I arrived," Timothy explained, his voice still trembling with shock. "I went to collect additional hymnals for evening service and found Mr. Collins lying beside the small table where we count collections. There was a length of wire nearby, and his throat—" He swallowed hard, unable to continue the description, but Dr. Hartwell's subsequent examination confirmed strangulation as the cause of death, likely occurring within the past hour. Inspector Barnes's attention soon focused on Peter Ashford, whose nervous demeanor and recent arrival in the village made him an attractive suspect, particularly when Mrs. Pemberton mentioned with obvious reluctance that she had been forced to reprimand him severely that morning for his clumsiness with her prize flowers. "He seemed unusually agitated and resentful," she declared with dramatic emphasis, muttering under his breath in a way that suggested dangerous instability. Miss Marple observed how the young man's hands trembled as he denied any involvement, his fingers bearing fresh cuts from florist's wire and stained with the green residue of plant sap. As the afternoon progressed and the police began their methodical questioning, Miss Marple found herself noting the subtle dynamics that emerged under pressure. Mrs. Bantry seemed almost defensive about her unexpected victory in the flower competition, repeatedly mentioning how surprised she had been by the judge's decision, while Colonel Weatherby kept checking his pocket watch as though anxious to be elsewhere. Most intriguingly, Sarah Collins appeared genuinely shocked by the news of her husband's death, but Miss Marple detected something else in her reaction, a quality that suggested she had been expecting tragedy to strike someone entirely different. The crime scene itself yielded several curious details that Inspector Barnes catalogued with professional thoroughness. A damp ring on the vestry table suggested a missing teacup, though Henry Collins was known to take his tea without sugar, yet granules were scattered across the wooden surface as though someone unfamiliar with his habits had prepared the beverage. A torn fragment of competition entry card lay crushed beneath the victim's heel, bearing the number 27 in Reverend Clement's careful handwriting, while a length of fine green florist's wire had been discarded behind a chest, kinked where it had been tightened and then cut. Miss Marple absorbed these details with the quiet attention she applied to all aspects of human behavior, recognizing that in cases of murder, the smallest inconsistencies often proved most significant. The village, having been jolted from its placid routine, buzzed with fearful speculation, each theory reflecting the speaker's own prejudices and limited understanding of their neighbors' true natures. As the golden afternoon light began to fade across the churchyard, she realized that Henry Collins' death was likely only the beginning of revelations that would shake Wisteria Village to its very foundations, for murder rarely occurred in isolation, but rather emerged from long-simmering resentments and carefully guarded secrets that respectable people preferred to keep buried beneath the surface of their ordered lives. The parish hall had transformed from a place of community gatherings into an impromptu police headquarters, its familiar warmth replaced by the clinical efficiency of official inquiry, and Miss Marple positioned herself near the tea urn, where she could observe the subtle interplay of fear and suspicion that rippled through the assembled villagers like disturbed water. Inspector Barnes had established himself at the central table with the confidence of a man certain that rural murders followed predictable patterns, his notebook open as he methodically catalogued statements that seemed to reinforce his growing conviction that Peter Ashford represented the most logical suspect, particularly given the young man's nervous demeanor and the damning physical evidence that continued to accumulate against him. Dr. Hartwell's medical examination had revealed details that troubled Miss Marple's orderly mind, particularly his quiet observation to Inspector Barnes that the strangulation showed unusual precision, suggesting either medical knowledge or exceptional calculation rather than the desperate struggle typically associated with crimes of passion. This clinical approach struck her as inconsistent with the image of an enraged young man acting in sudden fury, yet Inspector Barnes seemed to interpret the evidence as confirmation of premeditation rather than grounds for questioning his theory about Peter Ashford's guilt. Sarah Collins remained on her bench, accepting sympathy with mechanical grace, while her eyes held that peculiar quality Miss Marple recognized as shock overlaying deeper emotions. When approached with gentle concern, Sarah revealed information that immediately caught the elderly detective's attention. Henry had been receiving official correspondence recently, she whispered, her hand unconsciously protecting her unborn child. Letters that made him very serious and determined. He mentioned needing to settle old business before the baby arrived, and this afternoon he seemed almost excited about meeting someone at the church, though he wouldn't say who. This revelation transformed the crime from random violence to deliberate appointment, particularly when combined with the discovery of Henry's scattered papers in the vestry. Inspector Barnes had found a leather portfolio containing church financial records and, most significantly, a half-finished letter addressed to diocesan authorities mentioning serious irregularities and substantial sums unaccounted for, before breaking off abruptly, as though the writer had been interrupted by his killer's arrival. Mrs. Pemberton continued her theatrical denunciation of Peter Ashford, her voice carrying across the hall as she detailed his suspicious behavior with dramatic emphasis. "The young man has been increasingly unstable," she declared, gesturing toward her scattered daffodils. "This morning's incident was merely the latest example of his resentful nature. He mutters constantly about injustice and revenge, though he claims to reference his previous employment." Miss Marple noted how Peter Ashford, standing within earshot, made no attempt to defend himself, his silence seeming to confirm guilt in Inspector Barnes's increasingly suspicious gaze. Colonel Weatherby approached with military bearing, more pronounced than usual, as though discipline might ward off chaos threatening their community. Henry Collins had been asking rather pointed questions about village finances recently, he confided, adjusting his regimental tie nervously, particularly concerning the Church Restoration Fund. "As treasurer, I found his inquiries somewhat impertinent, though his position as churchwarden gave him certain rights." This information struck Miss Marple as potentially significant, especially when the colonel mentioned that Henry had requested detailed accounting records focusing on unusually large donations and expenditures. The physical evidence continued to accumulate in ways that seemed almost too convenient. The torn competition entry card bearing number 27 corresponded to Mrs. Bantry's heritage daffodils, though she protested genuine bewilderment about how it came to be crushed beneath Henry's heel. The scattered sugar granules troubled Miss Marple most of all, representing a detail that seemed deliberately placed rather than naturally occurring, particularly since Henry was known to take his tea without sugar, a fact Sarah confirmed with domestic certainty. As evening approached, Miss Marple excused herself for a brief walk, ostensibly to clear her head, but actually to examine the crime scene surroundings with the methodical attention that had served her well in previous mysteries. Near the Lich Gate, she discovered what Inspector Barnes had missed in his focus on obvious evidence. A small teaspoon lying in the shadow of the yews, its bowl bearing a minute bend as though someone had twisted it unconsciously during a moment of stress. She did not disturb the spoon, but noted its position carefully, recognizing it as the missing piece that explained the damp ring on the vestry table. The pattern of sugar granules also deserved closer examination, Miss Marple realized, for they were scattered not as though spooned, but spilled, and Henry's neat nature would have prompted immediate cleaning unless he was preoccupied or anxious to please someone whose presence demanded his complete attention. This suggested a private conversation where one party sought favor and the other sought reassurance, hardly consistent with a violent confrontation with an angry employee. Mrs. Bantry had mentioned the unexpected nature of her victory in the flower competition, repeatedly referencing those new judges from the county who insisted on scoring sheets rather than the usual familiar consensus, while Dr. Hartwell's eyes darkened whenever Sarah mentioned Henry's recent assurance that everything would be better by tonight. These fragments of information swirled in Miss Marple's mind like pieces of a complex puzzle, each seemingly insignificant detail potentially crucial to understanding the true nature of Henry Collins' murder. Inspector Barnes, satisfied with his straightforward theory about Peter Ashford's guilt, prepared to conclude his preliminary investigation, but Miss Marple sensed that the real mystery was only beginning to unfold. The murder had revealed fractures in their peaceful community that ran deeper than anyone suspected, and she recognized that before this case reached its conclusion, many carefully guarded secrets would be exposed, transforming neighbors into suspects and friends into potential enemies in ways that might never fully heal. Evening settled over Wisteria Village with the peculiar stillness that follows disruption, the last festival-goers departing with hurried glances toward the church where death had intruded upon their spring celebration, and Inspector Barnes, his confidence buoyed by what appeared to be overwhelming evidence, prepared to formalize the arrest of Peter Ashford with the satisfaction of a man who believed rural murders followed predictable patterns of obvious motives and convenient suspects. The young florist's assistant stood with resigned dignity as the inspector approached, his pale face showing neither surprise nor the desperate protestations one might expect from an innocent man facing such grave accusations. Though Miss Marple noted how his composure seemed less an admission of guilt than the weary acceptance of someone accustomed to being blamed for circumstances beyond his control. The evidence against Peter had accumulated with almost suspicious convenience throughout the afternoon. His access to florist's wire, the fresh cuts on his hands from that morning's work, his documented confrontation with Mrs. Pemberton, and most damning of all, his inability to provide a satisfactory alibi for the crucial hour between 1 and 2 o'clock when Henry Collins had met his death. Inspector Barnes had even discovered a crumpled note in Peter's modest lodging, written in Henry's careful handwriting and dated the previous day. "We must discuss your situation privately. The vestry at 1:30 tomorrow would be suitable." This apparent smoking gun delighted the inspector, who saw it as a proof of premeditated meeting leading to murder, though Miss Marple wondered why a guilty person would retain such incriminating evidence rather than destroying it immediately. Mrs. Pemberton watched the proceedings with satisfaction, barely concealed beneath her expression of civic concern, her earlier agitation replaced by vindicated righteousness as she declared to anyone within hearing that she had tried to warn everyone about Peter's unstable nature and dangerous tendencies. Yet Miss Marple observed how the woman's hands trembled slightly as she spoke, and how her eyes avoided direct contact with her accused assistant, as though genuine confrontation might reveal complexities she preferred not to acknowledge. More intriguingly, a faint green stain marked the clasp of Mrs. Pemberton's handbag, the residue of plant sap that contradicted her earlier insistence that she never allowed casual access to her valuable florist supplies. Dr. Hartwell's medical observations complicated the straightforward narrative Inspector Barnes preferred, his professional assessment revealing that the victim's injuries suggested someone of considerable strength, yet also showed restraint inconsistent with passionate violence. The wire was applied with precision, almost clinical in its efficiency. He reported quietly, an observation that troubled Miss Marple, who knew Peter Ashford as a slight young man whose physical capabilities seemed inadequate for overpowering Henry Collins, a robust individual despite his advancing years. The doctor's earlier behavior also deserved consideration, particularly his nervous gesture of brushing his right glove against his coat after emerging from the vestry, leaving the tiniest sprinkling of what might have been blossom pollen or perhaps the ubiquitous sugar that had been scattered so mysteriously around the crime scene. The question of sugar continued to perplex Miss Marple's orderly mind, for Henry Collins was known throughout the village to take his tea without sweetening. Yet granules had been scattered across the vestry table as though someone unfamiliar with his habits had prepared the beverage. The pattern suggested not careful spooning, but careless spilling, the kind of overpour that might occur when someone unaccustomed to serving himself attempted to be hospitable, then scraped back awkwardly when realizing his error. This domestic detail seemed inconsistent with Peter Ashford, who had been observed all morning making sugared water for flower arrangements, and would have moved with unconscious economy, born of professional familiarity. Colonel Weatherby's military precision proved valuable when he provided the detailed accounting records that Henry had requested earlier in the week, documents revealing several unusual transactions in the Church Restoration Fund that coincided with Peter Ashford's arrival in the village. Large anonymous donations had appeared regularly, always in cash, always accompanied by requests for discretion, creating a pattern that suggested either extraordinary generosity or systematic irregularities that a conscientious church warden might feel obligated to investigate. The timing troubled Miss Marple, who recognized that coincidences in murder cases often masked deeper connections than appeared obvious, particularly when she observed how the colonel unconsciously flexed a teaspoon between his fingers as he spoke, creating the same delicate curve near the bowl that she had noticed on the discarded spoon lying in shadow near the lich gate. Sarah Collins had provided information that further complicated the simple narrative of employee revenge when she mentioned Henry's recent correspondence with someone he described as an old acquaintance with unfinished business. Her husband had seemed almost excited about resolving whatever troubled him, declaring that everything would be clear by evening, and they could finally plan their future without shadows from the past. This eager anticipation hardly suggested a man expecting violent confrontation with a disgruntled assistant, but rather someone confident of achieving resolution through revelation or negotiation. The torn competition entry card, bearing number 27, corresponding to Mrs. Bantry's heritage daffodils, had been found crushed beneath Henry's heel in circumstances that struck Miss Marple as deliberately theatrical rather than accidentally significant. Mrs. Bantry herself had expressed genuine bewilderment about her unexpected victory in the flower competition, repeatedly mentioning the new judges from the county who had insisted on formal scoring rather than the usual familiar consensus, while Reverend Clement had privately admitted that the judging had been influenced by a substantial anonymous donation contingent upon fair consideration for all competitors regardless of social position. This revelation suggested someone had deliberately manipulated the competition to humiliate Mrs. Pemberton, though the connection to Henry Collins's murder remained tantalizingly unclear. As Inspector Barnes prepared to conclude his investigation with Peter Ashford's arrest, Miss Marple approached him with the gentle persistence that had served her well in previous encounters with official certainty. "Inspector, might I suggest that the evidence, while compelling, raises certain questions that deserve consideration?" She outlined the inconsistencies that troubled her. The clinical precision of the murder versus Peter's emotional instability, the convenient preservation of incriminating evidence, the victim's apparent eagerness for the fatal meeting, and most significantly, the pattern of anonymous donations that suggested hidden financial relationships within their seemingly transparent community. Inspector Barnes listened with polite skepticism, his confidence in the case's resolution unshaken by what he considered an elderly lady's natural tendency toward unnecessary complication. "Miss Marple, I appreciate your concern, but the evidence speaks clearly. Young Ashford had motive, opportunity, and means. Sometimes the obvious solution is simply the correct one." Yet as he spoke, Miss Marple noticed how several villagers exchanged glances that suggested shared knowledge they preferred to keep private, and she realized that Peter Ashford's arrest, while satisfying the inspector's need for closure, might actually be protecting the real murderer by providing a convenient scapegoat whose guilt everyone could accept without examining their own consciences too closely. The true killer, she suspected, was far more calculating and deeply entwined in the fabric of Wisteria Village than anyone currently imagined, and the real motive lay buried beneath layers of respectability and carefully maintained facades, waiting for her patient observation to bring it into the light. Inspector Barnes moved with the decisive confidence of a man certain that rural murders followed predictable patterns, his hand already reaching for the handcuffs that would formalize Peter Ashford's arrest, when Miss Marple stepped forward with the gentle persistence that had served her well in previous encounters with official certainty. "Inspector, might I suggest that arresting Mr. Ashford publicly tonight would cause considerable distress to Mrs. Collins in her delicate condition and perhaps create unnecessary panic among the villagers. A quiet watch until morning would serve justice equally well while preserving community peace." Her reasonable tone carried the weight of village propriety, and Inspector Barnes, practical enough to prefer an orderly conclusion to his investigation, agreed to delay the formal proceedings until dawn. Constable Fitch escorted Peter back to his modest lodgings with the discretion befitting a small community's attempt to maintain dignity in the face of tragedy, while Miss Marple found herself drawn once again to the sealed vestry, where careful observation might reveal details that official haste had overlooked. The evening light cast long shadows across the churchyard, and in that golden dimness she approached the crime scene with the methodical attention that had proven invaluable in her previous encounters with human nature's darker manifestations. The vestry door remained sealed with official tape, But Miss Marple's practiced eye could examine the surrounding area where Inspector Barnes had focused primarily on obvious evidence rather than subtle inconsistencies. Kneeling carefully beside the window, she peered through the diamond-paned glass at the table where Henry Collins had taken his final tea and immediately noticed what the inspector's eagerness to close the case had caused him to miss entirely. The scattered sugar granules were not the fine white crystals typically found in the church kitchen, but coarser particles with a distinctly golden hue that caught the fading light like tiny amber beads. This discovery struck Miss Marple as profoundly significant, for Henry Collins was known throughout Wisteria Village to take his tea without any sweetening whatsoever, a preference his wife Sarah had confirmed with domestic certainty. The presence of raw sugar, expensive and uncommon in their rural community, suggested someone else had prepared the fatal beverage, someone whose refined tastes differed markedly from both Henry's abstemious habits and the church's practical supplies. Moreover, the pattern of spillage indicated not careful spooning, but nervous overpour, the kind of accident that might occur when someone unaccustomed to serving themselves attempted hospitality while under considerable stress. The torn fragment of competition, entry card bearing number 27, deserved equally careful examination, for its damage showed characteristics that troubled Miss Marple's orderly mind. The tear was not clean like paper ripped in haste, nor jagged from being crushed underfoot, but rather showed the frayed edges typical of material subjected to twisting pressure, as though someone had gripped it unconsciously during a moment of extreme agitation before realizing their error. Along one edge, barely visible in the fading light, she detected a faint residue that might have been hand cream or perhaps the specialized polish used by those who maintained delicate instruments or valuable objects. Dr. Hartwell's evening rounds brought him past the churchyard, his medical bag suggesting professional duties, though his lingering near the sealed vestry indicated personal interest in the crime's resolution. When Miss Marple mentioned her observations about the sugar, his reaction was swift and telling, a sharp intake of breath followed by careful neutrality that suggested recognition quickly suppressed. Raw sugar is certainly unusual, he admitted reluctantly, though not impossible to obtain for those who prefer its distinctive flavor. His hands, usually steady with surgical precision, trembled slightly as he adjusted his medical bag, and when she pressed gently about his examination of the crime scene, he revealed information that Inspector Barnes had apparently dismissed as medically irrelevant. There were traces of pharmaceutical powder on the victim's clothing, Dr. Hartwell confided, his professional discretion warring with obvious anxiety. Nothing that contributed to the cause of death, but curious nonetheless. Such substances might enhance alertness or reduce natural caution, though of course they're common enough in any household medicine cabinet. His explanation seemed reasonable yet incomplete, particularly when Miss Marple recalled Sarah Collins mentioning that Henry had seemed unusually energetic and optimistic on the morning of his death. Emotions that might be artificially enhanced to ensure cooperation during what proved to be his final meeting. Colonel Weatherby appeared at the churchyard gate with military timing that suggested he had been observing their conversation from a distance, his bearing more rigid than usual, as though discipline might ward off the chaos threatening their orderly community. His accounting records continued to reveal troubling patterns that Inspector Barnes had dismissed as irrelevant to Peter Ashford's obvious guilt, but Miss Marple recognized their potential significance in establishing the complex web of relationships that motivated murder in small communities where everyone's business eventually became public knowledge. The evidence that had seemed so convincing to Inspector Barnes began to reveal inconsistencies that troubled Miss Marple's methodical approach to human nature's infinite variations. Peter Ashford's retention of Henry's supposedly incriminating note suggested either criminal stupidity or innocent preservation of correspondence he considered important for reasons unrelated to murder. The clinical precision of the crime contradicted his alleged emotional instability, while The raw sugar implied sophisticated tastes inconsistent with a young man's modest circumstances and practical background in floriculture. Most significantly, the pharmaceutical traces suggested access to medical supplies that pointed toward someone whose professional position would normally place them above suspicion, yet whose involvement in Henry Collins' death might run deeper than anyone currently imagined. As darkness settled over Wisteria Village with the peculiar stillness that follows disruption, Miss Marple realized that Peter Ashford's arrest had provided everyone with a convenient resolution that allowed them to avoid examining the deeper currents of resentment and secret relationships that actually motivated the murder. For in her experience, the most dangerous criminals were often those who appeared most helpful in solving the very crimes they had committed. The dawn brought with it the inevitable conclusion Inspector Barnes had orchestrated, and Miss Marple watched from her cottage window as Peter Ashford was led away with the quiet dignity of someone who had long since ceased expecting fairness from the world. The young man's arrest seemed to lift a weight from Wisteria Village, allowing its residents to breathe more easily now that the threat had been contained and labeled. Though Miss Marple recognized this relief as premature and potentially dangerous for an innocent man whose only crime appeared to be arriving at precisely the wrong moment in their community's carefully hidden history. The morning's activities provided Miss Marple with opportunities to pursue the inconsistencies that troubled her methodical mind, beginning with a visit to Mrs. Bantry, whose unexpected victory in the flower competition continued to perplex everyone involved. Over tea, served with particular attention to the sugar bowl, Dolly revealed information that struck Miss Marple as profoundly significant. "I brought a small jar of Demerara sugar for the judge's refreshment," she confided, though those modern men preferred their own thermoses. "The jar went missing after luncheon, and I assumed I'd simply mislaid it among the serving plates, but now I wonder if someone borrowed it for purposes I hadn't considered." This revelation connected directly to the raw sugar found scattered in the vestry, for Demerara possessed exactly the golden hue and coarse texture that had caught Miss Marple's attention the previous evening. The theft suggested deliberate planning rather than spontaneous violence, indicating someone had prepared carefully for Henry Collins' final meeting, even to the detail of providing refreshment that would put the victim at ease while demonstrating unfamiliarity with his abstemious habits regarding sweetened beverages. Sarah Collins proved equally helpful when Miss Marple called to offer condolences, producing Henry's pocket diary with the trusting openness of someone whose grief had not yet transformed into suspicion. The entry for the day, for Humpty, of his death was brief but illuminating. 1:30 C.W. Vestry. Bring tea, 2 sugars. The initials struck Miss Marple as particularly significant, for they could refer to Colonel Weatherby, whose military precision and role as church treasurer would have made him a natural person for Henry to consult about financial irregularities, while the notation about sugar confirmed that Henry had been preparing to serve someone whose preferences he knew well enough to anticipate. More revealing still was an envelope addressed in Henry's careful handwriting, containing a character reference for Peter Ashford that praised his diligence, skill, and trustworthiness, while recommending him without reservation for positions requiring integrity and discretion. This document demolished Inspector Barnes's theory about employee resentment, suggesting instead that Henry had been protecting Peter from some threat that required official documentation of his good character, perhaps in anticipation of accusations that might arise from his presence in Wisteria Village. Dr. Hartwell's morning rounds provided another thread in the increasingly complex tapestry, his professional manner unable to entirely conceal the nervous energy that had characterized his behavior since the discovery of Henry's body. When Miss Marple mentioned the pharmaceutical traces found on the victim's clothing, his explanation about common household medications seemed reasonable yet incomplete, particularly given his documented access to substances that might enhance alertness while reducing natural caution, creating ideal conditions for a victim to cooperate with his eventual murderer. The post office yielded additional intelligence through Mrs. Trimble's encyclopedic knowledge of village correspondence, revealing a pattern of registered letters from London that had arrived for several prominent residents in the weeks preceding Peter Ashford's arrival. The timing suggested these communications were connected to his presence, perhaps investigating his background or warning recipients about potential complications arising from shared past experiences they preferred to keep buried beneath the surface of their respectable lives. Colonel Weatherby's study provided the most concrete evidence when Miss Marple called to offer condolences, ostensibly admiring his military memorabilia while observing domestic details that spoke volumes about his habits and current state of mind. The ornate silver sugar tongs on his tea tray bore traces of golden granules that matched the demerara scattered in the vestry, while his unconscious gesture of flexing a small object between his fingers created the same delicate curve she had observed on the discarded teaspoon near the lich gate, suggesting nervous habits that betrayed internal pressure despite his outward military composure. The Colonel's discussion of Henry's unfortunate meddling in church finances revealed genuine irritation beneath his expression of grief, particularly his emphasis on the anonymous donations that Henry had questioned with increasing persistence. "Always suggesting they weren't quite above board," he declared with stiff indignation, though Miss Marple noted how his eyes avoided direct contact when discussing the specific amounts and timing of these contributions, as though the details themselves might reveal more than he intended about their true source and purpose. The torn competition entry card, bearing number 27, began to assume greater significance as Miss Marple pieced together its connection to the broader pattern of deception and concealment. Mrs. Bantry's unexpected victory had clearly disrupted someone's expectations, while the card's presence beneath Henry's heel suggested it had been twisted during a moment of extreme agitation, perhaps when the victim realized that his scheduled meeting was not the friendly consultation he had anticipated, but rather a deadly confrontation with someone whose secrets he had inadvertently threatened to expose. As the morning progressed toward afternoon, Miss Marple realized that Henry Collins had died not because of anything he had done, but because of what he had discovered about the carefully maintained facades that allowed certain villagers to hide their true natures beneath the surface of community respectability. The pharmaceutical traces, the stolen sugar, the twisted teaspoon, and the financial irregularities all pointed toward someone whose medical knowledge, access to church funds, and intimate familiarity with village routines had enabled them to plan and execute a murder that would have succeeded perfectly if not for the methodical attention to detail that Miss Marple applied to all aspects of human behavior. Recognizing that in cases of deliberate murder, the smallest inconsistencies often revealed the deepest truths about human nature's infinite capacity for deception and self-preservation. The morning's investigations had yielded a wealth of seemingly insignificant details that Miss Marple recognized as potentially crucial to understanding Henry Collins' murder, and her methodical approach to gathering evidence led her first to the vicarage, where Reverend Clement's anxious demeanor suggested he possessed information that troubled his pastoral conscience. Over tea served with particular attention to the sugar bowl, he revealed that Colonel Weatherby had borrowed the duplicate vestry key 3 days earlier to review restoration ledgers at his convenience, returning it only yesterday afternoon with traces of silver polish that caught Miss Marple's attention as she examined the newer key with innocent curiosity while discussing memorial arrangements for Henry. The florist shop provided even more concrete evidence when Miss Marple called to order a tasteful spray for the church, her practiced eye cataloguing the various types of wire displayed on Mrs. Pemberton's shelves. The premium Chelsea green wire, stored in a lacquered box and described as too expensive for everyday use, showed characteristics that matched her memory of the wire found behind the vestry chest, its distinctive matte coating and chalky bloom contrasting sharply with Peter Ashford's brighter, springier supplies that left green residue on her fingers when she examined them with murmured apologies for her curiosity. Mrs. Trimble's encyclopedic knowledge of village correspondence revealed a pattern of registered letters from London that had arrived for several prominent residents in recent weeks, including communications from Barton and Nick's solicitors for Colonel Weatherby, a medical indemnity concern for Dr. Hartwell, and Harridge and coal auctioneers for Mrs. Pemberton, all marked urgent and arriving with suspicious timing that coincided with various developments in their seemingly peaceful community. Behind the parish hall, Miss Marple discovered fragments of a broken jar among the dustbins, its label washed but not entirely erased, bearing golden crystals that had held their shape where the sticky rim had dried. Most significantly, the larger shard showed faint impressions pressed into the sugar crust by something resembling tong tips. Two delicate ovals spaced precisely apart in a pattern she recognized as matching the rosebud motif on Colonel Weatherby's ornate silver sugar tongs, providing concrete evidence linking him to the stolen Demerara sugar found scattered in the vestry. The discovery was interrupted by an acrid scent that proved to be smoke seeping from the parish hall eaves, and within moments, flames were licking at the curtained windows with sinister intimacy that suggested deliberate ignition rather than accidental fire. The village responded with characteristic efficiency, forming bucket chains and organizing rescue efforts, while Miss Marple observed how each person reacted to this new crisis that threatened to destroy the very records Henry Collins had been investigating before his death. Inspector Barnes arrived to find the hall reduced to a smoking shell, with blackened beams standing like ribs against the afternoon sky. The carefully maintained ledgers and financial records reduced to ash and scattered fragments that would never again reveal their secrets to diocesan auditors. His immediate observation that Peter Ashford remained in custody eliminated the convenient scapegoat from suspicion, forcing him to acknowledge that someone else had orchestrated this destruction of evidence with timing that suggested intimate knowledge of the investigation's progress and official procedures. Dr. Hartwell's behavior during the emergency revealed nervous energy that contradicted his usual professional composure, particularly his insistence on examining Sarah Collins privately when she appeared distressed by the commotion. While his repeated assurances about stress-related episodes seemed designed more to prevent questions than to provide medical care, Miss Marple noted how his coat carried the clean sting of antiseptic mixed with something sweeter, perhaps the pharmaceutical traces that had been found on Henry's clothing, and might explain the victim's unnatural optimism on his final morning. Colonel Weatherby's reaction to the fire proved equally revealing, his military bearing unable to entirely conceal the suppressed rage of someone whose carefully constructed plans had been threatened by circumstances beyond his control. His unconscious habit of flexing a scorched teaspoon retrieved from the debris created the same delicate curve Miss Marple had observed on the discarded spoon near the lich gate, while his documented access to church funds and intimate knowledge of donation patterns made him increasingly viable as someone capable of systematic embezzlement disguised as anonymous contributions. The physical evidence told a story of meticulous planning and deliberate misdirection, from the stolen sugar that revealed unfamiliarity with Henry's abstemious habits, to the premium wire that suggested someone with access to expensive florist supplies rather than Peter's basic materials. The pharmaceutical traces implied medical knowledge used to enhance the victim's cooperation, while the financial irregularities provided motive for murder when Henry's conscientious investigation threatened to expose years of carefully concealed corruption. Mrs. Pemberton's theatrical accusations against Peter Ashford began to seem less like righteous indignation and more like calculated misdirection, particularly when Miss Marple considered her relationship with other prominent villagers and her access to both the competition judging process and expensive florist supplies that could have provided the murder weapon. The manipulation of the flower competition results suggested coordination between multiple parties rather than simple workplace resentment, while the torn entry card's presence beneath Henry's heel indicated it had been twisted during a moment of extreme agitation when the victim realized his friendly consultation had become a deadly trap. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the damaged parish hall, Miss Marple realized that Henry Collins had died not because of anything he had done wrong, but because his integrity as church warden had led him to investigate financial irregularities that threatened to expose a complex web of corruption involving some of Wisteria Village's most respected citizens. The fire had been intended to destroy the evidence permanently, but the murderer had not anticipated that Miss Marple's patient observation had already gathered enough physical proof to reconstruct the crime's true nature, revealing a killer whose professional position provided both motive and means, while their respected status enabled them to direct suspicion toward an innocent scapegoat whose arrest had nearly achieved the perfect crime through systematic manipulation of community prejudices and official procedures. The smoldering ruins of the parish hall cast long shadows across the village green as evening approached, and Miss Marple found herself drawn once again to examine the physical evidence that Inspector Barnes had catalogued with professional thoroughness, but perhaps insufficient imagination. The destruction had been methodical rather than random, targeting specifically the financial records that Henry Collins had been investigating, while leaving untouched the adjacent storage areas containing communion silver and ceremonial vestments that would have provided far more valuable targets for common thieves or vandals seeking maximum damage with minimum effort. Reverend Clement's distressed summons to the vicarage revealed information that transformed Miss Marple's understanding of the case entirely. The elderly clergyman sat in his study with the deflated posture of someone whose trust had been systematically violated, his hands trembling as he explained how Henry Collins had entrusted him with a sealed packet the evening before his death, requesting that it be kept safe in case of mischance, with the nervous laugh of someone who feared his caution might prove prophetic. The packet had vanished from the vicarage safe sometime during the morning, removed by someone with intimate knowledge of both its existence and the combination that protected it from casual discovery. The study itself bore traces of the intruder's presence that spoke volumes about their identity and methods. The safe showed no signs of forced entry, having been opened with professional precision by someone familiar with its mechanism, while the desk blotter revealed ghostly impressions of repeated handwriting practice, where someone had tested various versions of Henry Collins' signature until achieving satisfactory forgery. Most significantly, a faint sweetness lingered in the air, the distinctive scent of pharmaceutical preparations that Miss Marple recognized from her recent encounters with Dr. Hartwell's medical supplies. Only 3 visitors had called at the vicarage that morning, each with ostensibly innocent purposes that provided perfect cover for their true intentions. Colonel Weatherby had arrived first to discuss memorial arrangements and return the duplicate vestry key, his military bearing unable to entirely conceal the nervous energy that had characterized his behavior since Henry's death. Mrs. Pemberton had followed with altar flowers, her theatrical manner more pronounced than usual as she expressed concern for parish morale and community healing. Dr. Hartwell had completed the morning's parade of visitors, ostensibly checking on Reverend Clement's health, but actually positioning himself to assess the investigation's progress and eliminate any remaining threats to his carefully constructed facade. The physical evidence continued to accumulate in ways that revealed the killer's identity through systematic observation of human behavior rather than dramatic revelation. Dr. Hartwell's medical bag contained substances that could enhance alertness while reducing natural caution, precisely the combination needed to ensure Henry Collins's cooperation during their fatal meeting in the vestry. His access to pharmaceutical preparations explained the traces found on the victim's clothing, while his professional knowledge provided the clinical precision evident in the murder method that had troubled Miss Marple from the beginning. More damning still was the discovery of powder residue on items the doctor had handled, the distinctive talc used with surgical gloves that had transferred to surfaces he touched while attempting to cover his tracks. Miss Marple found traces on the vicarage door handle, the safe's combination dial, and, most significantly, on the duplicate vestry key that Colonel Weatherby had returned after borrowing it ostensibly to review restoration ledgers at his convenience. The powder's presence revealed that Dr. Hartwell had handled these items while wearing gloves, suggesting premeditation rather than spontaneous violence, The financial motive became clearer as Miss Marple considered the pattern of anonymous donations that Henry had been investigating with increasing persistence. Dr. Hartwell's expensive tastes and comfortable lifestyle exceeded what his rural practice could reasonably support, while his access to church funds through various committees provided opportunities for systematic embezzlement disguised as generous contributions from grateful patients who existed only in carefully falsified records. Henry's conscientious investigation had threatened to expose this long-standing fraud, making his death necessary to preserve the doctor's reputation and freedom. The pharmaceutical enhancement of Henry's mental state explained his uncharacteristic optimism and eagerness for the fatal meeting, while the stolen Demerara sugar revealed the killer's unfamiliarity with the victim's abstemious habits regarding sweetened beverages. Dr. Hartwell had prepared tea with the expensive sugar to demonstrate hospitality and put Henry at ease, not realizing that his gesture actually highlighted his lack of intimate knowledge about someone he claimed to know well as both neighbor and occasional patient. The clinical precision of the strangulation reflected medical training applied to murder, while the choice of premium florist's wire suggested someone with access to Mrs. Pemberton's expensive supplies through his treatment of her various ailments and his position as her trusted medical advisor. The wire's distinctive characteristics had been overlooked by Inspector Barnes, who focused on Peter Ashford's access to common florist materials rather than considering who might have borrowed or stolen the premium-grade wire that actually killed Henry Collins. As darkness settled over Wisteria Village, Miss Marple realized that Dr. Hartwell's helpful cooperation with the investigation represented the classic behavior of a killer who inserted himself into the inquiry to monitor its progress and misdirect attention toward convenient scapegoats. His immediate assumption of authority at the crime scene, his medical examination that emphasized details supporting the case against Peter Ashford, and his continued involvement in treating Sarah Collins's stress-related symptoms all served to position him as an invaluable ally to the investigation while actually protecting his own interests through systematic manipulation of evidence and witness testimony. The fire at the parish hall had been his final desperate gambit to destroy the financial records permanently, but Miss Marple's patient observation had already gathered enough physical and behavioral evidence to reconstruct the crime's true nature. The missing packet from the vicarage safe contained Henry's documented proof of the embezzlement, while the practiced signatures on the blotter revealed the doctor's intention to forge additional evidence if needed to support his deception. The pharmaceutical traces, the powder residue, the expensive sugar, and the premium wire all pointed towards someone whose medical knowledge, financial desperation, and access to church funds had transformed him from healer into calculating murderer, demonstrating once again that in Miss Marple's experience, the most dangerous criminals were often those whose professional positions provided perfect camouflage for the darkest aspects of human nature. The morning after the parish hall fire brought Miss Marple to a moment of decisive action, for she understood that confronting a killer required not dramatic accusations, but subtle psychological pressure that would compel the guilty party to reveal themselves through their own reactions to carefully orchestrated stimuli. Dr. Hartwell's helpful cooperation throughout the investigation had positioned him perfectly as someone whose medical expertise made him invaluable to the inquiry. Yet this very helpfulness had revealed patterns of behavior that struck her experienced eye as suspiciously convenient for someone genuinely innocent of Henry Collins' murder. Her opportunity came when Sarah Collins requested a consultation about stress-related symptoms affecting her pregnancy, providing the perfect pretext for Miss Marple to arrange what appeared to be a chance encounter at the doctor's surgery, while actually serving as a carefully planned test of his composure under unexpected scrutiny. She arrived bearing a small gift of preserves, her manner suggesting nothing more threatening than elderly concern for community welfare, though her sharp eyes immediately catalogued the surgery's details. the faint pharmaceutical sweetness that matched the traces found on Henry's clothing, the subtle tremor in hands that should have been surgically steady, and most significantly, the defensive alertness that replaced his usual professional confidence when she mentioned her morning discoveries. "Dr. Hartwell," she began, with gentle innocence, settling into the patient chair with the deliberate care of someone whose observations were disguised as casual conversation. "I've been puzzling over the most curious details from poor Henry's death. The sugar, for instance. Such expensive demerara scattered in the vestry when everyone knows Henry never sweetened his tea. One might almost think someone unfamiliar with his habits had prepared refreshment, perhaps trying to be hospitable while actually revealing their lack of intimate knowledge about a man they claimed to know well. His reaction was immediate and telling, a slight stiffening of posture, followed by the forced smile of someone whose professional training warred with personal anxiety. Stress affects people differently, Miss Marple. Perhaps Henry simply craved sweetness that day, or offered refreshment to his visitor. The explanation seemed reasonable until she produced the fragment of broken jar she had retrieved from behind the parish hall, its golden crystals still clinging to the rim where someone's nervous handling had left distinctive impressions. "Mrs. Bantry's missing demerara," she observed pleasantly, noting how his eyes fixed on the evidence with recognition quickly suppressed. And such curious marks in the dried sugar, 2 small ovals, precisely spaced as though someone had gripped it with delicate tongs while under considerable stress. The kind of nervous gesture that might bend silver spoons, perhaps, when anxiety overcame professional composure during moments of extreme pressure. Dr. Hartwell's medical training served him poorly now, for his attempt to maintain clinical detachment only emphasized the contrast between his usual confident manner and current defensive posture. "Miss Marple, you seem to be constructing elaborate theories from coincidental details. Sugar spills, bent spoons, hardly evidence of criminal behavior." Yet his hands moved unconsciously as he spoke, demonstrating the very flexing motion that had damaged the teaspoons found at both crime scenes, revealing intimate knowledge of evidence that should have been meaningless to an innocent observer. The psychological trap tightened as Miss Marple mentioned the pharmaceutical traces found on Henry's clothing, observing how the doctor's professional explanation about common household medications became increasingly elaborate and defensive. Such distinctive preparations, she mused, the kind that might enhance mental alertness while reducing natural caution, creating ideal conditions for a victim to cooperate with someone they trusted completely. Of course, only someone with medical training would understand the precise combinations needed to achieve such effects without arousing suspicion. His composure cracked visibly when she produced Henry's diary entry, noting their appointment. "C.W. Vestry, bring tea, 2 sugars." The abbreviation struck him like a physical blow, for it revealed not only that Henry had documented their meeting but had anticipated serving someone whose preferences he knew well enough to prepare accordingly. The initials could refer to anyone, he protested, but his voice carried the strain of someone whose carefully constructed alibi was crumbling under methodical examination. "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed with deceptive mildness. "Though combined with your access to church funds through various committees, your documented presence at locations where evidence was found, and your systematic insertion into the investigation to monitor its progress, the pattern becomes rather compelling, particularly when one considers how embezzlement through elderly patients' accounts would provide both motive for murder and means for the anonymous donations that Henry was investigating with such unfortunate persistence." The final blow came when she mentioned the missing packet from the vicarage safe, revealing that Henry's documentation of the financial irregularities had survived despite the fire that destroyed the parish hall records. Dr. Hartwell's professional mask shattered completely, transforming him from trusted village physician to cornered predator whose desperation made him dangerous to everyone present. "You meddling old woman," he snarled, his cultured voice revealing the ruthless calculation that had enabled him to exploit those who trusted him most. "You have no proof of anything beyond wild speculation and coincidental circumstances." "Perhaps not," Miss Marple replied with the quiet authority of someone whose patient observation had reconstructed truth from fragments others had overlooked. "But I find that guilty parties often reveal themselves most clearly when they believe their careful facades are threatened by inconvenient questions about their methods and motivations." As Dr. Hartwell's rage subsided into sullen recognition that his crimes had been exposed through the very helpfulness he had used to conceal them, Miss Marple reflected on how the most dangerous criminals were invariably those whose professional positions provided perfect camouflage for their true nature, demonstrating once again that in cases of calculated murder, the solution lay not in obvious evidence, but in patient observation of human behavior under pressure. For guilt inevitably betrayed itself to those who understood that the smallest inconsistencies often revealed the deepest truths about human nature's capacity for deception and self-preservation. Dr. Hartwell's mask of professional composure had finally shattered completely, revealing the calculating predator beneath. Yet Miss Marple remained seated with the unruffled calm of someone who had encountered such transformations before, her gentle voice continuing with a methodical persistence that had served her well in previous encounters with human nature's darker manifestations. "I find it curious, Doctor, how anger so often reveals truths that careful planning attempts to conceal, for your reaction to my observations speaks more eloquently than any denial about the accuracy of my conclusions regarding Henry Collins' murder." The surgery fell silent, except for the steady tick of the wall clock and Dr. Hartwell's labored breathing as Miss Marple continued her patient exposition of the evidence that had accumulated through careful observation rather than dramatic revelation. The Demerara sugar, for instance, tells such a complete story when one considers all its implications. Mrs. Bantry's missing jar, the golden crystals scattered in the vestry where Henry never sweetened his tea, and most significantly, the distinctive impressions left in the dried residue by your ornate sugar tongs, those delicate rosebud patterns that match the marks I found on the broken fragments behind the parish hall. Dr. Hartwell's hands trembled as she produced the shard of pottery, its crystalline coating still bearing the telltale ovals where nervous pressure had gripped the silver implements during moments of extreme stress. "You prepared tea for Henry that afternoon, didn't you? Attempting to demonstrate hospitality while actually revealing your unfamiliarity with his abstemious habits, for anyone who truly knew him would never have offered sugar in the first place." The pharmaceutical evidence proved equally damning when Miss Marple explained how the distinctive traces found on Henry's clothing matched the sweet scent that permeated the surgery. Substances designed to enhance mental alertness while reducing natural caution, creating ideal conditions for a victim to cooperate with someone they trusted completely. Only someone with precise medical knowledge would understand the exact combinations needed to achieve such effects without arousing suspicion, ensuring Henry's eager anticipation for your meeting rather than the wariness that might have saved his life. The physical evidence continued to accumulate as Miss Marple methodically reconstructed the crime's true nature, from the premium Chelsea green wire borrowed during house calls to Mrs. Pemberton, to the clinical precision of the strangulation that reflected medical training applied to deadly purpose. The bent teaspoon found near the lich gate bears the same curve as the one you unconsciously flexed during our conversation, a nervous habit that betrayed your agitation even as you attempted to appear helpful in solving the very crime you had committed. Dr. Hartwell's professional facade crumbled entirely as she revealed Henry's diary entry documenting their appointment, the missing packet from the vicarage safe that contained proof of systematic embezzlement, and the desperate fire that had been intended to destroy all evidence of financial irregularities disguised as anonymous charitable donations. You inserted yourself into the investigation with theatrical helpfulness, monitoring its progress while directing suspicion toward Peter Ashford, whose nervous demeanor and recent arrival made him a perfect scapegoat for someone whose respected position normally placed them above suspicion. The confession, when it finally came, emerged not as dramatic capitulation, but as weary acknowledgement that his carefully constructed deception had been penetrated by patient observation of details others had overlooked. Henry was going to expose everything, he admitted with the hollow voice of someone whose world had collapsed around him. Years of careful planning, building a practice that could support the lifestyle I deserved, using patients who trusted me completely and would never question their treatment or the financial arrangements I made on their behalf. The scope of his crimes revealed itself through systematic exploitation of elderly patients whose cognitive decline made them vulnerable to falsified records and forged authorizations, their trust transformed into opportunities for theft that funded both his comfortable existence and the anonymous donations that established his reputation as a generous benefactor, while obscuring the true source of stolen funds. Henry's investigation threatened everything I had built, his integrity making compromise impossible, and his documentation making exposure inevitable, unless I acted decisively to protect myself. Inspector Barnes arrived with the grim efficiency of someone whose confidence in obvious solutions had been thoroughly shattered. Dr. Hartwell's arrest proceeding with mechanical precision, while Miss Marple observed how professional collapse revealed the desperate calculation that had driven him to exploit those who trusted him most. The revelation of Peter Ashford's innocence brought immediate release and heartfelt apologies from villagers who had accepted his guilt too readily, their relief at finding convenient explanations, having blinded them to deeper currents of corruption that actually motivated murder in their peaceful community. As evening settled over Wisteria Village with the peculiar stillness that follows resolution of crisis, Miss Marple reflected on how the case had demonstrated once again that the most dangerous criminals were often those whose professional positions provided perfect camouflage for their true nature, enabling systematic exploitation of trust while directing suspicion toward innocent scapegoats whose guilt everyone could accept without examining their own consciences too closely. The daffodils that had celebrated spring's arrival continued blooming in golden profusion, their beauty persisting unchanged by human tragedy, suggesting that nature's cycles endured regardless of the dark impulses that occasionally surfaced in even the most respectable communities, while the village itself would heal from this trauma as villages always did, though the knowledge that evil could wear such respectable masks would linger as a sobering reminder that human nature's capacity for deception required constant vigilance from those who understood that the smallest inconsistencies often revealed the deepest truths about mankind's infinite complexity.